Hi everyone, and welcome to our video about writing and editing your essay for Art History 1006. So in the previous videos we looked at finding and developing your argument in terms of breaking down your question, coming up with a position and thinking about what you're going to say in your thesis statement, as well as planning a convincing structure. Once you have an essay plan, then it's time to start writing your essay. One thing to keep in mind is that many students at university face perfectionism, which can mean that if you feel like you have to get every single sentence absolutely perfect when you're drafting an essay before you move on to the next sentence, it's going to take a long time to write your essay, and it means that you're editing as you go. So instead, a really useful way around that to help you manage your time and to avoid that perfection and that kind of fear of writing or that writing paralysis is to think of it as really writing in rough drafts first of all. So if you know that you're a bit of a perfectionist and you like to get things perfect, try and acknowledge that and say to yourself, okay, yes, I can perfect it, but later on. My first couple of drafts are really to get the ideas down on the page. For those of you who enjoy this, then this is a really good opportunity as well to think about, okay, I'm getting some ideas down on the page, I can edit it later, I can put in extra stuff later, I can cut things out, and so on. It's pretty normal to write a draft essay and you'll end up being 1,000 or even 2,000 words over the word count. That's a pretty normal experience for most university students. So do keep in mind that as you go, leaving yourself time to edit is really, really important, to have that time to cut down the information that you're going to have to later on. So think about it as first and second drafts are really just for your eyes only. They're just to get the main ideas down on the page. It doesn't matter if there's repetition, it doesn't matter about getting the wording right, because those two first drafts, nobody else is going to see them, that's completely fine. The third draft onwards is where you might like to start actually editing and finessing things, drilling down into a bit more of the details, looking at the expression and so on. The polishing will happen as you draft. So that also helps you to think about your timeline. So I said in the first video that it's useful to think about planning out your essay to take over 3, 4, 5, possibly even 6 weeks to plan. Now, what you want to do is in the early stages focus on generating the ideas, and then in a couple of weeks after that, then start writing and planning your essay, and leave yourself at least 2 or 3 weeks to draft an essay like this, to actually put down rough ideas, then contribute more to it, then reflect on it, change it, make some more edits, polish it, and so on. When writing your essay, it's useful to follow this diagram as a bit of an essay structure. So we talked about structuring the ideas in terms of the last video. Today, in this video, we're going to talk about writing your introduction, how to write paragraphs, and writing a conclusion. Now, many of you will have heard about this stuff already. You might have seen a similar diagram in the past. It's useful just to know what differences there might be at university level essays. So let's start off with introductions. Usually introductions have 4 kinds of main elements. So first of all, a little bit of context about the topic. Then they will usually indicate what is the problem or the issue or the controversy or the debate that they are talking about in the essay. So in the first video, when breaking down the question, I got you to think about what is the relevant debate for your essay. That's because in your introduction, by acknowledging what the debate is, you're setting up why your topic is interesting and why your argument matters, why it's an argument in response to a debate. So then you put your thesis statement. So that's your key answer to the question with your key reasons. Now, the signposting key reasons is really, really important, and it helps your reader to know what ideas are you going to cover and in what order. Make sure that the signposting order follows the order that the ideas appear in the essay. So make sure it matches your essay structure. Okay, so let's have a look. Now, this is a sample introduction. I've taken this from Chris McAuliffe's article on Rosalind Drexler, one of his articles in an exhibition catalogue about Rosalind Drexler's work. Now, I've actually modified it to fit more of what a university essay structure looks like for an introduction. So what we've got here is in the black section, you've got the context. So what Chris is doing is he's setting up what is the piece of work about. And what's it look like? So if you're analysing an artwork, starting off with a little bit of a description of the artwork might help. Starting off a little bit with the artist, what their background is might help, or even what genre do they belong to. Then what happens in this introduction is to set up the problem or the debate. Now in this case, what Chris is setting up is the fact that compared to peers such as Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, Drexler's work is rarely included in pop art exhibitions, particularly in large pop art exhibitions. So this lack of attention to Drexler suggests that her work might lack distinction. Now this is where I've edited it to match that question that I came up with before. So that is setting up what's the question, what's the problem that we're looking at. Then in the purple is the thesis statement. So here is the answer to that question. However, I argue that while Drexler's work continues in the same vein of much pop art, it is nevertheless distinctive. So very clear, very direct answer to the question. Finally, in the red, we've got some signposting. Drexler uses stage composition, flat surfaces, and depictions of pop culture in unique ways which extend that genre of pop art. So I would expect this essay to actually follow that order. First of all, talking about stage composition, then flat surfaces, then depictions of pop culture. Now, in many essays, you might even use very direct signposting, and this is where there might be a difference between what you learnt in high school, for instance, where teachers might have said, don't use signposting, don't use first, second, third. But here at university, because you're writing longer essays, because you're writing many more essays and the markers are marking many more essays, and because you're now well equipped to be able to have that clear signposting where it's not over the top, you can use it a bit more. So I wouldn't be surprised to see an essay where it says, first I examine the stage composition. The following part examines flat surfaces of Drexler's work, and so on. We'll see some more examples. So here's another example of an introduction. Now this one is taken from a real student university essay. So this one is taken from an ANU student from a few years ago about an art theory course. Now this one is about postmodernism. So they've been asked, is postmodern art an empty parody of past styles, or does it have a critical function? So again, what they have first of all is a bit of setup in the context. Then they have the debate. So a key feature of postmodern art is an unresolved debate. They've been quite direct about that. And they set up whether people think that postmodern art has a critical function or not. And then they argue in the purple that it is the inclusion of the variable process of parody. They focus on parody throughout the essay that gives postmodern work their critical function. So it's arguing that yes, postmodern art does serve a critical function. Then they've got signposting towards the bottom here. So now this one is actually very direct signposting. First I examine, next I analyse, and analysing these two artists' work reveals that postmodern art indeed does perform a critical function. So again, reiterating their argument at the end of that introduction. So very direct, very clear signposting there. It's doing all the right things in terms of an introduction. Now here's another example, just to have, just to see a bit of variety. So for this one about Rodin's sculpture, The Burghers of Calais, again, context in the black. Now here we have the debate in the blue and the argument again in the purple. I've put in a little bit of black in here because this is a little bit more context. It's showing, you know, Rodin's four figures are in the NGA close by. And then signposting at the end. This paper will firstly outline before focusing on, and so on. So your signposting can be quite clear. What's very, very important is that in the introduction, you have your thesis statement nice and clear. So then it's time to have a think about your paragraphs. Now your paragraphs each have to follow a very kind of set structure. So they usually have three things: topic sentence, supporting evidence, and a concluding and linking sentence. Now, the concluding and linking sentence is not always seen in every single paragraph, and in the examples that we have here, some of them don't include them. That's okay. The most important thing in the paragraph is that you've got a topic sentence that captures your argument and the evidence to support it. So we're going to have a look. So thinking about your paragraph structure, remember that it's one main idea per paragraph, and that a paragraph is roughly 150 to 200 words. Think about it as having those three main things. So if you were trying to eat a burger without the buns, it won't necessarily be easy to eat. So your topic sentence and your concluding sentence performs that function of making it digestible, making it easy to pick up, easy to understand. So let's have a look. Here's the sample paragraph. So what you have here is, first of all, the topic sentence in red shows that they're talking about the flat, clean surface in Drexler's work and mass media imagery in this paragraph. Now this is the topic of the paragraph, whereas in purple here is the overall answer to the question. So your topic sentences should do both things. So your topic sentences have to tell me what's the purpose of the paragraph, but also why does it answer the question? Don't forget that bit. That's the most common thing that is most difficult about topic sentences. So always ask yourself, how does this paragraph answer the question? Make sure you've got that answer in there. You can try a variety of wording, variety of phrasing to help you with that, to make it not so repetitive, for instance. Then towards the end, what I've got here is highlighted in red again, that summary sentence, that concluding and linking sentence, where it shows me, okay, so in this paragraph we talked about the process, the flat, clean surface, the use of fields of color and collage and so on. So we've got that reiterated in that final sentence, and then again a reiteration of the overall argument, neither a painting nor a collage. So why is it distinctive as pop art? So here is why it's distinctive. Because it's unusual. So notice that in your topic sentence you have to do the two things. Tell me what the paragraph is about and tell me what the answer is. Your concluding sentence will also do the same. So here's another example of a sample paragraph. I've modified this one just to change things up a little bit. So thinking back to your question, how distinctive is Drexler's work compared to pop artists at the time? It makes, again, the argument very clear. So the purple is the argument. So unlike other pop artists, Drexler's work employs a certain narrative staging. So this is the key reason why it's distinctive. And then in here, it's talking about, okay, so in this paragraph, we're going to be talking about compositions. Then, as we go through the paragraph, the author is giving evidence for the analysis, and again concluding with a sentence that shows, so having looked at the compositions in red, in this way, compositions employs a form of storytelling. And here, the purple is reiterating that argument that Drexler's work is distinctive because it reinserts a narrative compared to other pop artists, such as the use of speech bubbles in Roy Lichtenstein's work, for instance. So looking at those paragraphs, you've got a sense of the use of evidence to support the point. Now, when you have a paragraph that is a little bit empty, doesn't have much evidence, that's then a point where you can think about, what is the purpose of this paragraph? Do I have evidence to add to it? Or is this a linking idea? In which case, you move the linking ideas to attach to their respective paragraphs. And this is much more common, to have paragraphs that are huge, that go over one page, for instance. If they're longer than a page, it's way too big. You need to cut it down to 150 to 200 words. So when you have a lot of evidence, do consider splitting it up into multiple paragraphs. Sometimes it might just be that you've repeated things a little bit, so you might just cut it down. Now, thinking about your paragraphing as well, the type of evidence that you use and the way that you analyze your evidence is really important. Now, the most common kind in art history is where you get description without interpretation, where the person is just describing the work. Now, that is not the best use of your word count, because a description could be done by anyone. What your marker really wants to see is your analysis. So this description without interpretation, it says each image is defined by orange or blue color, fields, and bordered off by thin white bands. Okay, yep, great, that's description. And then there's interpretation. So sometimes people will put in their interpretation of, what do I think the work means? And without some evidence to back you up, or without that that analysis to back you up, it can sometimes come across as being a little bit unfounded. So the visual analysis is what you want to aim for. So you want to aim to have a visual analysis that incorporates both description and interpretation and analysis, and you can even include the secondary sources that you have used throughout the essay. So for instance, here we have each image is spatially confined to a floating cell defined by orange or blue color fields. So, okay, it's describing this work first of all, and then they're giving their interpretation. What is the effect? Finally, they're showing us what that means for the argument. So they're showing us that, okay, so it invokes this corridor, so that's about the narrative elements, and it employs a form of storytelling and reinserts that narrative. So it's showing me why that visual part of the work and why that interpretive aspect of the work helps them to build their analysis. So make sure that you do all three in your essay. If you find that you're doing a lot of description or a lot of interpretation without analysis, then you really need to pull those back and focus your time more on showing why does this answer to the question. You also need to have a think about how you incorporate sources into your writing. So there's a few different ways to do that. So quoting, paraphrasing, summarizing, and synthesizing. Now, quoting is where you copy the other people's words. Paraphrasing and summarizing is actually where you put it into your own words. And that is the most preferred way to use sources in your essays. Now, that said, quoting is used occasionally, but very sparingly. So we're going to start off with paraphrasing and summarizing because that's what you're going to be doing most of all. So with summarizing and paraphrasing, the idea is that you change the structure and the phrasing of the ideas that you're taking. You also need to show your understanding and your analysis of what the points mean. So you need to, whenever you're summarizing and paraphrasing, have a think about what is the idea that the author is showing and why is it relevant to my work. Make sure you give a reference as well. So let's have a look. So we've got this example here from this is a made-up source. So it's saying it's important to recognize that the role that patrons' personal tastes played in influencing 17th century paintings motifs. So first of all, to paraphrase well or to summarize well, have a think about what are the relevant ideas. Here I've done a bit of a breakdown in terms of, okay, there are two ideas in this sentence. So patrons' personal tastes, first of all, and 17th century paintings motifs. So one way to do it would be to change the structure, flip it around, and then have a think about the phrasing. So you could, for instance, flip it around to make a paraphrase this way. So you reverse it, and then you change the wording. Now in here, what we've done is in the red text, personal tastes has become own preferences. You could also change 17th century to 1600s, and influencing has been changed to swayed. Now that's okay to use as a bit of a change of wording. Some technical terms you won't be able to change. So patrons you probably shouldn't change because it's a very technical term in art history, and motifs, yeah, you might find a bit of a difficult time trying to find something else to capture that. So you can keep the technical terms, but do make sure that you change the structure and as much of the wording as you can. Now this example will also need a reference. So when you paraphrase an idea from a particular spot, you will need a reference for that source, preferably with a page number if it's from a book or from a journal article that have pages. Then what you need to do is also think about how you group ideas together. So as you're reading, you might find that multiple authors are talking about this idea. So actually grouping together those ideas, synthesizing those ideas can be really handy because they show that you've done a wide variety of reading and that you can classify those ideas together. So the paraphrasing example that I showed you before was very narrow, very specific, whereas what you want to aim to do is to summarize a bit more and synthesize. So in here and in many of your readings, you'll see this. So one author suggests that similarly early studies. So they've got a focus on one key study, whereas they've also got a bit of a summary of what other studies do. So one thing that is very, very handy is to think about as you take notes, grouping those ideas together. Go back to that for and against brainstorm or mind map, for instance, or go back to your mind maps and start to categorize, well, which authors belong to which groups of ideas, and show your critical analysis. So here in purple, what the author is doing is they're saying, okay, well, with the word suggest, they kind of agree, but they're not entirely sure. Whereas down here, they're saying that they agree most of all with these later studies. So these more recent studies provide strong primary evidence for, so they've shown why they agree with those studies more. Okay, now with quotations, do make sure that you do them sparingly. So only really use quotations when things like paraphrasing would change the meaning, or when you're actually focusing on how the source is worded. It can also add some strong emphasis to your argument, but only if used very briefly and very rarely in your work. So with quotations, you keep the wording the same, you put them in quotation marks, and you give a reference. Do introduce it as part of your sentence. Don't just start a sentence with the quote. Instead, introduce it by saying, Smith claims that, or Drexler's work shows that, and then there's a quote. It helps the reader to see why there's a quote here, or what the quote is about to say. And make sure that you actually explain it. So after you give a quote, or before you give a quote, you will actually need to explain why it's relevant to your work. So here we've got a bit of explanation before and after the quote of what that quote means. This is why paraphrasing can actually save you a bit of space, because you don't have to do this with paraphrasing, because your paraphrase already shows the idea. So with quotations, you do keep it at the same, including the emphasis that they use. So if something's in italics in the original, keep it in italics in yours. But if you want to change things, if you want to add emphasis, for instance, you do need to explain that you have changed it. Similarly, if you have cut out words, you need to show it using the ellipsis or the 3 dots to show where those words have been cut. And if you've changed words to make it more grammatically correct, to make it fit your sentence, do indicate that with square brackets around the words that you have changed. If you happen to notice a typo, for instance, in the original, then you can indicate that it's their typo, not yours, by using the sic in square brackets. Now with long quotes, if you do happen to use a long quote, it's usually, if it's over 3 lines long or 30 or 40 words, then what you do is you present it like in this example on the right hand side here. You indent it, no quotation marks, but you do still keep a reference. And it's a good idea to explain why you've used a long quote, because a long quote takes up a lot of your word count, a lot of the space on the page, and you do have to analyze it in a lot of detail to really justify why it's there. So do think about long quotes carefully. Finally, use the Turnitin practice site as well to check whether your quotes and paraphrases are accurate. So the Turnitin practice site is accessible via Waddle. I'll put a link on your Waddle site, and you can use it to put in your work, see whether each of the text matches are okay or not. There's no ideal number, there's no ideal percentage that's a good percentage or not. You need to actually check each individual text match to see whether they're okay. All right, so once you've kind of got your ideas in your paragraphs and you're heading towards your conclusion, in your conclusion, what you want to generally include is a summary of your argument, so a summary of your position and the key reasons, and a bit of an explanation about why is this important? So what? What does all of this mean? So here's a sample conclusion with some common problems, because conclusions are really tricky to write. When you're wrapping it up and you're trying to explain what does this all mean, it can get a little bit waffly, like this one does here. So on this one, what's happening at the start is there's a whole lot of information about postmodernism, but it doesn't actually bear relevance to the essay very closely. Another really common problem is that you're trying to make grand claims in conclusions, and that can sometimes lead to generalizations, statements that can't actually be backed up. So this statement here will always be contentious. You can't have the proof to back you up. So it's like making an argument where you say the sun will always rise in the east. You can't prove that. You can't prove that in 50,000 years the sun won't rise in the east, because we're just not around to have that evidence. So what you need to do is be careful. Just ask yourself, Is this actually true? Here's a modified example of that same conclusion. So what I've done here is first of all summarize the argument and shown why it's relevant to the debate that they set up at the start of the essay. So here is an analysis of Bennett and Young's works. So what they've done here is they've signposted the key reasons. So the essay focused on Bennett and Young's works, and here in purple I have argued that postmodern art can perform a critical function. So answering that question about whether postmodern art can perform a critical function, they've summarized again here, yes, it can. And then what they're doing is to situate that argument in context of why is it important? So what? What does this mean to the debate? So the debate was about whether postmodern art can explore contemporary ideologies with appropriation in a meaningful way. Basically, is postmodern performing a critical function, even though it's full of lots of parodies, full of lots of self-references and so on. And then what they've done is go into a little bit more detail about how their argument showed their response to that debate. So they've summarized their key reasons, so Bennett's self-reflexivity and intertextual references, and Young's appropriated images. So that's what they've talked about in the essay in that order, Bennett and then Young. And they've shown us that those references and images are used to invite critical reflection on cultural identity and otherness. So that's their argument. This is why Bennett and Young's works do perform a critical function. And then again, they've reflected on why that's important. Now, this conclusion doesn't necessarily need to happen in that order. The main thing is that you do think about that question of what is my argument, what are my key reasons, and then why is that meaningful? Okay, so once you've written your essay, once you've gone through a few sessions of putting down your ideas, coming up with what you're going to put in your paragraphs, writing up your intro, writing up your conclusion, then it's time to sit back and start thinking about editing your essay. Now, like I said before, treat this editing process as taking place over a week or two and edit in this order. So argument is the most important thing. It's your answer to the question. So make sure you start with that. There's no point starting off with expression until you know what you're going to say. So edit in this order. First of all, edit for your argument. Is your answer to the question clear? Is it actually in the introduction and in the conclusion? Is it the same in both? It should be the same, just worded differently. And are your key reasons outlined in the introduction? Then edit for your structure. Is it a convincing structure? Is it persuasive? Do your topic sentences actually show your argument? Is it logical? Then edit for paragraphing. Now this might be the third or fourth or fifth edit that you do, where you look at the paragraphs. Are they too long? Are they too short? Do they need to be split up? Does it have too much evidence? Can you condense it? And is it correctly cited? Start getting into the details. So then edit finally for expression. That's really where you focus first of all on long sentences. They're too long. Can they be shortened? Can it be made snappier? Does your writing show exactly what you mean? Are your word choices accurate? And is there any repetition that you could cut out? Do your sentences flow? Read it out loud as a bit of a test. So that's covered the process of how to find and develop your argument, how to come up with your thesis statement, how to write and how to edit your essay. You can come and see us for advice, so you can book appointments, and we do Zoom appointments for advice on your essays, and I'll see you for your course as well. And here's the reference to that source that we used about Drexler. I modified it quite a bit in the examples, and the other examples that we used were from confidential ANU student essays. Okay, thank you.